New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the history of psychic archaeology. With me is Stephan Schwartz, who has conducted more successful psychic archaeological expeditions probably than any other human being in history. Before he began his actual explorations, he wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, in which he explored this fascinating history. He is also the author of the Alexandria Project, a book about one of his expeditions, as well as the 8 Laws of Change. Welcome, Stephan.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. It's unusual, I think, in the history of parapsychology for somebody to write a historical book analyzing previous work, and then, as I recall in the appendix of that book, you laid out a methodology. If this work was going to be done today, here's how it should be done in great detail, and then you went out and did it.
That's true. The Secret Vaults of Time and Opening to the Infinite, which is the other book, the last one,
yes,
are... I saw remote viewing as an engineering problem.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, specifically, what I had in mind was anti-submarine warfare.
Oh.
You know, the officer on a surface ship is trying to find a submarine. He is in one environment, the submarine's in another environment, or domain, if you will. He never actually sees it. He sees it only through the interposition of electronic sensors.
Mm-hmm.
And my conception of remote viewing, because I always began from the perspective, not is it real, but can you do anything with it?
Yeah.
Because if you can do something with it, then it must be real. And so the anti-submarine warfare, you know, he has towed arrays, electronic things that are out there. He has to conform with their limitations. He has to speak their language. He has to understand how to interpret what they're telling him. And only in that way can he perform his function. Well, in a sense, my perception of what I was doing was exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
The remote viewer is contacting one domain. I'm in another domain. I have to understand the limitations of the viewer. I have to understand the parameters under which he's operating. I have to be able to interpret what he's saying. So I conceived of this from the beginning as an interdisciplinary, because I don't believe in omniscientist. Yeah. So I always saw this as an interdisciplinary activity. And the reason I got to archaeology, I originally wanted to find black holes. Mm. And I went to a friend of mine in Arizona who was one of the senior astronomers on the telescopes down there. And he said, your chances of doing this are 0 because people wait years to get time on a telescope, and they're not going to turn it over to some cockamamie idea.
Yeah.
Remote viewers are going to find black holes.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what else could I do that was triple blind? Because I always started from the perspective that it should be triple blind if possible.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was, because I've always been interested in anthropology, and I was reading a lot of stuff in the archaeological literature about where to look. How do we know where to look? So much of our finds are serendipitous. If only we had a way we could find things that would be ever so much better.
Because many archaeological sites are buried.
Well, they're not only buried, but they're discovered serendipitously. You know, some peasant is taking his cart along a pathway or somewhere out in the outback, and he comes across a hole, and he looks in the hole, and there's something, or the road collapses, or they're building a new road and they expose it. It's all serendipity.
But you did discover that throughout history there have been archaeologists who worked with psychics.
Well, to pick up your original point. So I thought, well, okay, archaeology. Well, if I'm going to do archaeology, what has gone before?
Yeah.
And so The Secret Vaults of Time is the book that I wrote after doing a number of years about 5 years of careful research in the use of non-local information in archaeology. Because I wanted to know what had been done, and could it be done, and had been successful, and how did they do it, and what ought to have been improved. And I remembered when I started this research, I remembered at university reading Herodotus's histories, and in the 46th chapter of Herodotus, there is the first outbound remote viewing. And it's done exactly the way it would be done today.
Double blind. And where people are doing what amounts to an outbound protocol. Where the king of Lydia, as I recall, posed a challenge to the Oracle at Delphi.
Well, not just Delphi. Croesus, the king of the Lydians, now part of Turkey, was in his capital at Sardis, and he got intelligence that Cyrus, the king of the Persians, was going to invade him. Well, what to do? Because the Persians were a very big empire, and the Lydians were really quite small. So he didn't know what to do. So he sent out what he called embassies, basically a group of guys, and he gave them very specific instructions. He said, you are to wait until the 100th day from today when I'm giving you these instructions. And when it is the 100th day, you are to go into the oracle. He went to the 7 oracles of the ancient world. And you are to say, what is Croesus, son of Alietes, king of the Lydians, doing? And you are to write down the answer. I mean, it all sounded, but that's a whole conversation about how pre-technological cultures kept cadres of people, of remote viewers, to help guide them. But anyway, he sent out these embassies, these 7 embassies, and we only know what one of them said because that was the successful one, and so that's the one Herodotus recorded. And they went to Delphi, and they went to see the Pythoness. These are young girls in their early teens who were sitting in a kind of cat's cradle thing over clefts in the earth. Some people think that it's not entirely agreed, but some people think that the hydrocarbons that bubbled up from the earth acted essentially as psychoactive substances and put the girls in a kind of altered state of consciousness, and they were trained to be remote viewers, basically. And so when the embassy went in on the 100th day, the Pythoness, even before they asked the question, said, I can count the sands of time, the 100 days. I can see the great oceans that they had come from far away. And lo, I see a shell-covered tortoise and a lamb in a great bronze cauldron and a great bronze lid. And so they wrote all this down. It just sounded like nonsense. They wrote it all down, and they went back, and when they got back, all the embassies, they all presented what their particular oracle had told them. And when it came to Delphi, Croesus got down and bowed and gave obeisance, because on the 100th day he had thought to himself, what is the most unkingly thing I could be doing. And he had a big fire built in the courtyard of his palace and a big bronze tripod brought in and a great bronze urn. And he personally cut up a lamb and a tortoise and threw them into the water, exactly as she had described. So I remembered that. And then, as when I was doing my original research with Edgar Cayce, I had run across an account of a man named Jacques Aymir, who was a kind of uber peasant.
Let's just for a second, though, let's go back to Croesus.
Okay.
Because as I recall, the story goes, the oracle told him, well, if you go to war against the Persians.
I know, so then he went back. Yeah. No, that's the second question.
Yeah.
So then he goes back to the Oracle of Delphi and he says, what's going to happen in this potential war between himself and Cyrus? And the oracle says, if you cross this river, a great empire will fall. And of course, because he sees the Persians as much bigger than him, he thinks, that must mean that I will prevail over the Persians. Yeah. In fact, it was his own empire that fell. Yeah. But yes, when the second time. But the reason we know this is that in the ancient world, the cultures of the ancient world maintained cadres of people at these 7 oracles who were basically a cadre of remote viewers whose job, mostly young people, whose job it was not to speak themselves, but to speak in the voice of the god or goddess that they represented, to give guidance to the culture. And that's quite common, by the way. That's a whole other subject, but this is quite common. The Kogi in Colombia today still do this. They have a group of young men they take when they're 9 years old and put them in a cave, and they're only attended by their parents and the priests, and they're basically taught to be remote viewers. They're known as the mamas. In any case, so I remembered that from university. And then when I was reading this material down at the ARE, I came across this story.
Association for Research and Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where I spent 5 years doing the basis, the scholarly research that I did before I became an experimentalist.
Preparation.
Yes.
Very important.
Yes. And so I came across this story, and the story is that on the 25th of July, 1692, a merchant and his wife were killed with a cleaver. And they couldn't solve the crime. And those kinds of murders of a well-to-do merchant, there weren't a lot of them in France at that time. And they, in the frustration at not being able to solve the case, one of the French officials suggested that they bring this kind of uber peasant named Jacques Aymar, to come, and he got there. He was a dowser. What few people realize is that from the 1200s to the 1600s, a lot of the extraction of metals, metal ores, was done as a result of dowsing. They located them with dowsing. And you can see old books where you see the dowsers. And anyway, Aymar said that they were killed by the merchant and his wife were killed by three men, and he guided them to Beaucaire, about 100 miles away, where out of a lineup of men, 13 men, he picked one man who then confessed. He'd been arrested for theft, completely unrelated, and Aymar said, "You're the murderer." And when they pressed him, he admitted that he had been, and then Aymar led them to where the other two men, and they had just crossed over to Grenoble, so they were out. They couldn't catch them. And I remembered reading this, and out of that, the Abbé of Valmont had written a book called Occult Physics about the use of dowsing, and that resulted in the first scientific test of non-local consciousness. The Prince de Condé had the French Academy of Science prepare 6 holes, and in one hole is empty, one hole they put gravel, and the other 4 holes they put different metals. And Eimer was correctly able to identify which was the empty hole, which was the hole with gravel, and which hole had the metals, but he couldn't distinguish between the different kinds of metals. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading this, and so I thought, well, that's directly applicable to archaeology. Mm-hmm. So when I began doing this research, I started looking.
It's also, I suppose, applicable, his work, to psychic criminology and to
well, yes. I mean, he was
the use of psychics in oil and mineral exploration.
Yes, exactly. Uh-huh. And so I thought, well, I'll focus on archaeology. Yeah. Astronomy, I'm not going to be able to do it. So I will focus on archaeology. Mm-hmm. And I want to know what was done before, as I said. So I started, and the first thing that I came across was Frederic Bligh Bond, mm-hmm. who was the man who reconstructed Glastonbury Abbey.
A very famous archaeological site in England.
Well, it was, until Henry VIII destroyed it, it was one of the leading Christian centers in the British Isles. Mm-hmm. And
if I recall correctly, associated with the Grail legend.
Yes. Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to have come there, and they have a tour, and a holy spring that's associated with healing. And
it's still regarded as a sacred location.
Oh, a sacred location long before Christianity, going back to the Druids and maybe before that even. So it's always been a sacred site. But Bligh Bond, of course, Henry VIII took it over, took everything out, and it fell into ruin. And Bligh Bond was hired as the archaeological director. Mm-hmm. And he began, with a British Army officer, doing what today we would call automatic writing. This was at a time when the British upper classes were very involved with spiritualism and theosophy, and it was a big part of the sort of upper class English.
Late 18th, early 20th, or late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, it's he starts early 20th century. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Blavatsky and all that goes beforehand. Yeah. Anyway, he, using automatic writing, gets guidance, he thinks, from the monks who actually had been at the Abbey. Mm-hmm. But in any case, they tell him where to dig.
He himself was the automatic writer.
He and this British officer would sit across from one another, holding a pen and trying to clear their minds, but to hold the intention that they would receive guidance about where to dig, because he had a very limited budget, and he was a very ambitious man. He wanted to make a big splash. He was known for his work on rood screens and things like that, but this was his real opportunity. And so he wanted to be successful, and he was interested in consciousness things, I guess we would say, because that was part of that part of England at that time, that kind of history. Anyway, he got very specific guidance. And I actually, when I was doing the research, I went to England and interviewed men who were then in their 80s or 90s who had been workers. Mm-hmm. And they said he would come out in the morning and he would gather a team of diggers, local men, and he would just walk out into a field. I mean, because then it was nothing but ruins. He'd walk out onto these just green sward, and he would say to them, now start digging here. And he would put a line down, and he'd dig along here. And by God, they would dig along there, and a wall would come up. And in that way, he was able to reconstruct the cathedral and the abbey. Mm-hmm. And he found all kinds of things. And he was greatly lionized, because this was a very big deal at the time. Yep. And then he wrote a little book called The Gates of Remembrance, which told how he did it. Mm-hmm. And that just was unacceptable to the scientists of the day, the archaeologists of the day. So he lost his position. He ended up cleaning the implements that he had found when he had been the director. It's a very sad story. And when I went there, this is in the very early 70s, probably about 73, 72, when I started the research for that book and interviewed these people. When you went there, there was no mention of Bligh Bond, except there was a model that he had built, and in it was a little tiny label that said constructed and based on research by Frederic Bligh Bond. And I wrote the Archbishop of Canterbury and said, could I come and see any files they had on Bligh Bond? And they wrote me back, and the Archbishop wrote me back and said, we don't discuss Mr. Bond and have nothing to say about this subject.
Oh.
Now I understand. I haven't been back there in a number of years, but I understand they're giving him a little more credit. But he reconstructed this. And if you look at his excavations and you look at his reconstructions and what he started with, it is really quite extraordinary because, as I say, these men that actually did the work, they said they never could figure out what he was doing. It never made any sense to them. He'd just walk out in the field and say, oh, dig here, from here to here, and he'd stake it out, and they would dig, and there would be the thing. And a lot of things. He found a tomb with, all sorts of stuff. Yeah. So I started with that.
Yeah. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but it's fair to say you found another maybe half dozen to a dozen other comparable examples.
Yes. And so I started with Bligh Bond, and then Stephan, a Polish chemical engineer who worked with a man named Stanislaus Poniatowski, who was the leading ethnographer of Poland. That one was particularly moving for me because they did all these 39 experiments to reconstruct the pre-modern history of Poland during the Nazi occupation, when doing such research could get you killed. Yeah. And yet they felt it was so important, this group of scientists that were working with Osiewski, to keep doing it. Then I came across C.S. Reed, a young archaeologist in Canada who used a man named George McMullen, who later became one of my viewers, to locate an Iroquois site that he had been searching for 2.5 years. George found it in 2.5 hours.
Now, wasn't that Emerson?
Norman Emerson was his committee chair. Okay. And he was doing his master's thesis, and he was about to fail because he had never been able to find the site. And Emerson, who was the father of Canadian archaeology, said, well, I have this is a little strange. I have this man who might be able to help you. And he brought out this guy who was the parts dealer, manager of the parts department of a Chrysler dealership in Nanaimo, and said, see what you can do, George. And George, in 2.5 hours, staked out the palisade. It was a palisade. He described it. Nobody had ever seen one like it. He laid out the longhouses inside the village, and the grains that they would discover there, all kinds of things.
So Emerson, as you say, the father of Canadian archaeology, had prior experience with McMullen.
Yes, he had met McMullen and had done several projects with McMullen, and been very impressed. Clarence Woolsey Wyatt, who's the discoverer of that great Olmec head that we see in the tequila ads and a number of other things, and who was one of the really significant archaeologists, anthropologists of the early 20th century. The Smithsonian published a special bulletin on him. Used Emil Tagoma, who was a Mayan worker, who was also a shaman, and he guided him to all these sites that he found. So anyway, I found about 10 or 11 prior examples of people using what I would think of as non-local consciousness in order to locate archaeological sites. And the beauty of the archaeological sites is it's all triple blind. I mean, everybody agrees that this place exists, but nobody knows where it is. And what I began to do when I began to research was not only to use remote viewing to find things, but I also I arranged to have run by an independent authority, an independent expert, an electronic remote sensing survey of the same area to see whether you could find electronically what the remote viewers were finding with non-local consciousness. And in every case, you could not. And I'm not talking about casual. I mean, when I did the Eastern Harbor in Egypt, Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's Palace, the Timonium, the Lighthouse of Pharos, I got the side scan sonar work done by Harold Edgerton of MIT, who had invented side scan sonar.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, all of my work has always been interdisciplinary. I know that most parapsychologists feel that they are not respected and that people dismiss them. And my experience has been very different. I have always gone to the top of whatever specialty area I needed because of my conception of what's going on. And I've never been turned down. I mean, Harold Edgerton, who was then one of the most famous scientists in America, I sent him a telex from Cairo and said, I'm using remote viewing to do a survey of the Eastern Harbor in Alexandria, Egypt. Will you come over and do the side scan sonar parallel to it?
Well, I think what you're saying is scientists who are at the very top of their profession are more open-minded than the middle tier.
Yes. What I learned out of all this, and it's completely consistent with Thomas Kuhn, probably the leading historian and philosopher of science in the 20th century, if you talk to people who are the first tier people, many of them have gotten there because of their own intuitive experiences that have allowed them to make breakthroughs, and they're open. It's the second tier and third tier people whose reputations are tied to peer acceptance, who are very uncomfortable doing anything that's out of the norm.
People are so afraid of being associated with magical thinking.
Yes, exactly. Whereas when you look at Max Planck, I mean, he gives an interview in 1931, and he's one of the most famous scientists in the world, and he says, they say to him, what have you learned? You're the father of quantum mechanics. What have you learned? And to their astonishment, this is the observer, and he does this very knowing what he's doing. He's speaking publicly through a very prestigious venue. He's trying to get something across. He's not doing this casually. He says, what I've learned is that consciousness is fundamental and causal. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time, materiality arises from consciousness, not consciousness from materiality.
What a good note to end on, Stephen. It's been a journey exploring all of this with you, and I'm delighted to let our viewers know there's more to come. So
all right.
Thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.